Hello everyone. My name is Alex Winters, and I bring you the most terrifying real stories from around the world. Today's story is something that will keep you awake at night, because what I'm about to share with you challenges everything we know about reality itself. Picture this. You're driving through the remote countryside of northern Scotland. The GPS stops working. Your phone has no signal, and suddenly you find a town that doesn't exist on any map. A place where the residents smile too wide, where the clocks all show different times, and where every road you take somehow leads you right back to the town square. What would you do if you discovered that this town has been collecting visitors for decades, and none of them have ever left? Before I begin, I can see that most of my viewers haven't subscribed while watching my videos. So please hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and ring that bell icon so you never miss my terrifying content. Also, please comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and if you have your own paranormal experiences, email us or drop them in the comments. I absolutely love hearing from you all. Now, let me tell you about Callahan Morrison, a 28-year-old travel photographer from Edinburgh. His story began 3 months ago, during what should have been a simple road trip through the Scottish Highlands. Callahan was documenting abandoned castles and ancient stone circles for his upcoming photography exhibition. He had planned a week-long journey through the most remote parts of Scotland, areas where tourism rarely reached and nature still held its ancient secrets. It was a Tuesday morning in early September when Callahan packed his camera equipment into his reliable Land Rover. The weather forecast predicted clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect conditions for outdoor photography. He had mapped out his route carefully, planning to visit several locations that were rumored to have fascinating historical significance. His first destination was the 13th century castle ruin near Loch-Katrine, approximately 300 kilometers from Edinburgh. The drive started perfectly. Callahan enjoyed the winding roads that cut through heather-covered hills and dense pine forests. He stopped frequently to capture the dramatic landscape, the way morning mist clung to the valleys, how ancient stone walls seemed to emerge from the earth itself. His camera clicked steadily as he documented the wild beauty of the Highlands. Each photograph told a story of Scotland's mysterious past. By early afternoon, Callahan had covered nearly half his planned route. He was feeling confident and energized, excited about the shots he was getting. The sun was positioning itself perfectly for golden hour photography, which would begin in a few hours. He decided to push deeper into the countryside, following smaller and smaller roads that promised even more secluded locations. That's when his GPS began acting strangely. The screen flickered, showing his location jumping erratically across the map. Sometimes it placed him hundreds of kilometers away. Other times it couldn't locate him at all. Callahan wasn't too concerned initially. He had experienced GPS problems in remote areas before. The thick forest canopy and hilly terrain often interfered with satellite signals. He continued driving, relying on road signs and his general sense of direction. The roads became narrower, barely wide enough for one vehicle. Ancient stone walls lined both sides, creating a tunnel-like effect that blocked out much of the afternoon sun. The landscape felt increasingly isolated, as if he was traveling back in time, away from a modern world and deeper into Scotland's forgotten past. After another hour of driving, Callahan noticed something odd. He hadn't seen another vehicle, or even any signs of modern life, for over 40 minutes. No power lines, no cell towers, no buildings of any kind. Just endless stone walls, dense woodland, and winding roads that seemed to go on forever. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat over the engine noise. His mobile phone showed no signal, which wasn't entirely surprising given the remote location. But something felt different about this particular stretch of countryside. There was a quality to the light, a thickness to the air, that made everything seem slightly unreal, as if he had crossed some invisible boundary into a place that operated by different rules. Then, just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Callahan crested a small hill and saw something that made him pull over immediately. Spread out in the valley below was a town, not a village or a hamlet, but a proper town with dozens of buildings, church spires, and what appeared to be a main street lined with shops and houses. But here's what made Callahan's blood run cold. This town wasn't on any of his maps. He had studied every detail of this region, every settlement, every landmark, every historical site. He knew there was nothing here except empty countryside for at least 50 kilometers in any direction. Yet there it was, nestled in the valley, like it had always been there. Smoke rising from chimneys, warm light glowing in windows, looking as real and solid as any town he had ever seen. Callahan sat in his vehicle for several minutes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He checked his maps again, both the physical ones and the GPS, when it briefly flickered back to life. According to every source he had, he was looking at empty moorland, but his eyes told a completely different story. The town was undeniably there, and it looked inhabited, prosperous even. Curiosity overcoming his confusion, Callahan decided to investigate. After all, discovering an unmapped settlement would be an incredible addition to his photography project. He might have stumbled upon something truly significant, perhaps a community that had somehow been overlooked by modern cartographers. It seemed impossible in the age of satellite imagery and GPS mapping, but stranger things had happened in remote areas of Scotland. The road leading down into the valley was well maintained. Unlike the narrow country lanes he had been traveling, this was a proper two-lane road with fresh asphalt and clear white lines. Street lamps lined both sides, though they weren't yet illuminated in the early evening light. Everything about the infrastructure suggested this was no forgotten backwater, but a thriving modern community. As he drove into the town, Callahan was struck by how normal everything appeared. The buildings were a mix of traditional Scottish architecture and more modern constructions. Stone cottages with slate roofs stood alongside brick houses with neat gardens. The main street featured a variety of shops, a bakery with fresh bread visible in the window, a pharmacy with green cross signage, a post office with the familiar red Royal Mail colors. But there were subtle wrongnesses that began to accumulate in Callahan's mind. The street signs were slightly off. The fonts weren't quite standard. The spacing between letters seemed irregular. The shop names were familiar, yet strange. Morrison's Bakery, Highland Chemist, Royal Post. Generic enough to seem normal at first glance, but lacking the specific character that real establishments usually possessed. Callahan parked his Land Rover in front of what appeared to be the town hall, an impressive Victorian building with a clock tower that dominated the main square. The clock showed 4:15, which seemed about right given the position of the sun. He gathered his camera equipment and stepped out onto the sidewalk, immediately noticing how quiet everything was. Not the peaceful quiet of a small town in the evening, but an almost oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even his footsteps. There was no background hum of traffic, no distant voices, no barking dogs or chirping birds. The only sound was the gentle creaking of shop signs and the light breeze. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath. Despite the eerie quiet, there were clear signs of recent activity. Fresh tire tracks on the roads, warm light glowing from house windows, the smell of cooking food drifting from chimneys. Someone had clearly been here very recently. Perhaps they were all indoors having dinner. Callahan told himself that small towns often seemed deserted during meal times, especially in areas where community dining was common. He began taking photographs, documenting the architecture and layout of this mysterious settlement. Through his camera lens, everything looked perfectly normal. The images showed a typical Scottish town with well-maintained buildings and clean streets. But somehow, experiencing it in person felt completely different. There was an quality of unreality, as if he was walking through an elaborate movie set rather than a genuine community. After exploring the main street for about 20 minutes, Callahan finally encountered another person. An elderly woman emerged from the bakery carrying a paper bag. She was dressed in a long coat and headscarf, typical attire for an older Scottish woman, but something about her movement seemed mechanical, rehearsed, as if she was performing the role of a townsperson rather than simply going about her daily business. When she noticed Callahan, her face broke into a wide smile. Too wide. The expression didn't reach her eyes, which remained cold and calculating. "Good evening," she said in a pleasant voice that somehow managed to sound both welcoming and threatening. "You must be new to Millbrook. We don't get many visitors here." Callahan introduced himself and explained that he was a photographer documenting remote Scottish communities. The woman's smile never wavered, never changed intensity. It remained fixed at that uncomfortable level of enthusiasm. "How wonderful," she replied. "I'm Aloan Davies. Welcome to our little town. You'll find we're very hospitable to travelers." When Callahan mentioned that he hadn't been able to find Millbrook on any of his maps, Aloan's expression flickered for just a moment, the smile faltering before snapping back into place. "Oh, the maps are often outdated in this part of Scotland. We're a bit off the beaten path, but that's what makes us special. We like our privacy." She invited him to stay at the local inn, explaining that it would be dangerous to drive the mountain roads at night. The proprietors were lovely people, she assured him, and they would take excellent care of him. Her insistence was polite but firm, and something in her tone suggested that refusing might not be wise. Callahan felt increasingly uneasy, but he also recognized that she was right about the roads. He had been driving for hours through increasingly difficult terrain, and attempting to navigate back in darkness could indeed be dangerous. Besides, staying overnight would give him more opportunities to photograph the town and hopefully solve the mystery of why it didn't appear on any maps. Aloan led him to the inn, a 3-story building with warm light spilling from its windows. The sign above the door read the Highland Inn, painted in elegant script that looked freshly touched up. Everything about the establishment seemed welcoming, yet Callahan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led into some kind of trap. The innkeeper was a middle-aged man named Dorian Craig, who greeted them at the door with the same unnaturally wide smile that Aloan had worn. His handshake was firm, his manner friendly, but his eyes held that same cold calculation. "A photographer," he said with apparent delight. "How marvelous. We so rarely have artists visit our little community." Dorian showed Callahan to a comfortable room on the 2nd floor. The accommodations were better than he had expected. Clean linens, modern bathroom facilities, even a small television and telephone, though when he tried to use the phone, there was no dial tone, just empty silence. Dorian explained apologetically that they had been having problems with the phone lines, something about underground cables being damaged by recent storms. For dinner, Callahan joined Dorian and several other residents in the inn's dining room. The meal was excellent, traditional Scottish fare prepared with obvious skill. Haggis with neeps and tatties, fresh salmon, hearty vegetable soup. The conversation was pleasant, focused on local history and the beauty of the surrounding countryside. But as the evening progressed, Callahan began to notice disturbing patterns in the dialogue. The residents all told very similar stories about their families and backgrounds. Their anecdotes had a rehearsed quality, as if they had been practiced many times. And whenever he asked specific questions about the outside world, about recent news or events, they would deflect or change the subject. Most unsettling of all, every clock in the dining room showed a different time. The grandfather clock in the corner read 7:30. The wall clock above the fireplace showed 9:15. His own watch displayed 8:45. When he mentioned this curiosity, the residents exchanged quick glances before Dorian laughed and explained that timekeeping had always been a bit relaxed in Millbrook. After dinner, Callahan excused himself and went for a walk around the town. The streets were now lit by old-fashioned lampposts that cast pools of warm yellow light. Windows glowed invitingly in houses and shops, but he still encountered very few people. Just occasional figures moving in the distance, always disappearing around corners before he could get a closer look. He tried to explore the outskirts of town, to see where Millbrook ended and the countryside resumed. But every road he followed, every path he took, somehow curved back toward the town center. It was as if the settlement was surrounded by some kind of invisible barrier that gently redirected any attempt to leave. Callahan told himself he was simply getting turned around in the dark, that he would have better luck navigating in daylight. Back in his room at the inn, he attempted to review the photographs he had taken, but when he connected his camera to his laptop, he discovered something that made his hands shake. Every image he had captured showed the same thing. Empty countryside, desolate moorland, rolling hills covered in heather and gorse. There was no trace of Millbrook in any of his photographs. It was as if the town didn't exist, at least not in any way that digital sensors could detect. Callahan checked and rechecked his camera settings, examined the images at maximum resolution, even tried different viewing software. The results were always the same. According to his camera, he had spent the day photographing uninhabited wilderness. Yet he was clearly sitting in a comfortable room in the middle of a thriving town. Sleep came fitfully that night. Callahan's dreams were filled with images of endless roads that led nowhere, clocks that ran backwards, and smiling faces that watched him from every window. He woke repeatedly, each time hoping to find himself back in his Land Rover on some normal Scottish road. But every time he opened his eyes, he was still in the inn room, still trapped in impossible Millbrook. Morning brought no relief. If anything, things seemed even stranger in daylight. Callahan discovered that his mobile phone battery had drained completely overnight, despite being fully charged when he went to bed. His laptop was also dead, and none of the charging cables he had brought seemed to work. The electrical outlets in his room provided power to the lamps and television, but they wouldn't charge any of his electronic devices. Dorian served him breakfast with the same unsettling smile, explaining cheerfully that they sometimes had issues with the electrical system, something about the town's unique location interfering with modern electronics. He suggested that Callahan might want to extend his stay, perhaps spend a few days really exploring and documenting their community. When Callahan insisted that he needed to leave, that he had appointments and commitments back in Edinburgh, Dorian's expression darkened for just a moment before the smile returned. "Of course," he said, "though I should warn you, the roads can be quite confusing. Visitors sometimes find themselves driving in circles. It's easy to get lost." Determined to escape whatever strange situation he had stumbled into, Callahan packed his equipment and headed for his Land Rover. Several townspeople gathered to see him off, all wearing those same two wide smiles, all offering friendly warnings about the difficulty of navigating the local roads. Their concern seemed genuine, yet there was something almost predatory in their attention. Eloan approached him as he loaded his cameras into the vehicle. "Are you sure you want to leave so soon?" she asked. "Millbrook grows on people. Most visitors find they want to stay much longer than they originally planned. Some decide never to leave at all." Her words sent a chill down Callahan's spine, but he forced himself to smile and thank her for the hospitality. He started the Land Rover and drove slowly down the main street, watching the townspeople wave goodbye in his rearview mirror. Their figures remained perfectly still, arms raised, smiles fixed, until he turned a corner and lost sight of them. The road out of town seemed straightforward enough, a clear route that led up the valley wall and back toward the hills. Callahan felt his tension beginning to ease as Millbrook disappeared behind him. Perhaps he had simply stumbled upon an eccentric community that preferred isolation. Maybe the strange behavior of the residents was just small-town suspicion of outsiders. But his relief was short-lived. After driving for what felt like an hour, following roads that should have taken him far from the valley, Callahan found himself approaching a familiar hilltop, the same vantage point where he had first spotted the town. And there below him, exactly as it had been the evening before, was Millbrook. Impossible. He had been driving away from the town, following roads that led in completely different directions. Yet somehow he had ended up right back where he started. Callahan checked his compass, verified his direction, studied the position of the sun. Everything indicated that he should be kilometers away, but the evidence of his eyes was undeniable. He tried a different route, this time turning left instead of right, following what appeared to be a completely separate road system. The landscape looked different, more forested, with rocky outcroppings that he didn't remember from the previous day. Surely this path would lead him away from the valley and back to the outside world. 2 hours later, he was looking down at Millbrook again. The town sat in its valley, like a spider in the center of an invisible web. No matter which direction he traveled, no matter how carefully he navigated, every road eventually brought him back to that same hilltop overlook. It was as if the entire region had been twisted, folded in on itself in some impossible way. Panic began to set in. Callahan pulled over and tried to think rationally. There had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps he was suffering from some kind of neurological problem, a brain tumor or medication side effect that was causing hallucinations and disorientation. But his camera equipment was real. The town was real. The people were real. Everything had physical substance and consistency. He tried his mobile phone again, hoping that distance from the town might restore the signal. But the screen remained blank, showing no network coverage, no GPS data, nothing that would help him determine his location or call for help. His electronic devices seemed to be completely dead, as if they had been drained by some unknown force. As evening approached, Callahan realized he had no choice but to return to Millbrook. He was running low on fuel, and the idea of spending the night alone on these impossible roads filled him with dread. At least the town offered food and shelter, even if the residents were strange. Better to face known oddities than unknown dangers. The townspeople greeted his return with apparent delight, though there was something unsurprising about their reaction, as if they had been expecting him. Dorian welcomed him back to the inn with that same wide smile. "Back so soon," he said pleasantly. "I told you the roads could be confusing." That night at dinner, Callahan tried to question the residents more directly. He described his attempts to leave, his experiences with the looping roads, the way every path led back to town. Instead of seeming surprised or concerned, they all nodded knowingly, as if this was completely normal. "Millbrook is a special place," explained an elderly man named Maverick Stone. "Not everyone understands our unique geography. The town has its own relationship with space and time. Most outsiders find it difficult to navigate." Serafina Bell, a woman who claimed to be the local schoolteacher, added with a dreamy smile. "The town chooses its residents. Some people are meant to stay. You can't fight destiny." Their casual acceptance of the impossible situation was almost more frightening than the situation itself. They spoke of supernatural phenomena, as if discussing the weather, treating reality-defying events as mundane local characteristics. It suggested that whatever was happening in Millbrook, it had been going on for a very long time. Callahan spent the next several days attempting different escape strategies. He tried leaving at different times, following various routes, even abandoning his vehicle and attempting to hike out on foot. The results were always the same. Every path led back to Millbrook. Every journey ended at that familiar hilltop overlooking the valley. During his explorations, he began to notice other disturbing details. The town's population seemed to fluctuate. Sometimes he would encounter dozens of residents going about their daily business. Other times the streets would be nearly deserted, as if most of the inhabitants had simply vanished. When he asked about missing people, the remaining residents would look confused and claim not to know who he was talking about. He also discovered that many of the shops and buildings were facades. The bakery that Aloan had emerged from turned out to be empty, just hollow rooms with no equipment or inventory. Several houses had no back walls, revealing them to be theatrical sets rather than actual residences. Yet somehow, when viewed from the street, everything appeared perfectly normal and functional. Most disturbing of all were the other visitors. Callahan began encountering travelers who, like himself, had stumbled upon Millbrook and found themselves unable to leave. There was Marigold Winters, a German tourist who had been trying to escape for 6 months. Dorian mentioned casually that she had initially been quite upset, but now seemed much more settled, more accepting of her situation. There was also a French couple who claimed they had been in Millbrook for over a year. They had given up attempting to leave and now helped run one of the local shops. Their eyes held a vacant quality, as if some essential part of their personalities had been gradually worn away. When Callahan tried to discuss escape plans with them, they would smile politely and change the subject. "You'll understand eventually." Marigold told him during one of their conversations, "Fighting it only makes things harder. The town has its reasons for keeping us. We're part of something important here, something bigger than ourselves." Her words chilled Callahan to the bone. He could see the same gradual transformation beginning in himself. The constant stress of failed escape attempts, the isolation from the outside world, the relentless cheerfulness of the residents. It all combined to create a psychological pressure that was slowly breaking down his resistance. He began to notice changes in his own behavior, moments when he found himself genuinely enjoying conversations with the townspeople, times when the idea of staying in Millbrook seemed almost appealing. Then was comfortable, the food was good, and there was a strange peace in accepting that his old life was gone, that he was part of something new now. But whenever he caught himself thinking such thoughts, Callahan would force himself to remember who he was, his life in Edinburgh, his photography career, the exhibition he was supposed to be preparing. He would look at the photographs on his camera, the images of empty countryside that proved Millbrook's impossible nature, and use them to anchor himself to reality. Weeks passed in this strange limbo. Callahan continued his daily attempts to escape, while slowly watching other trapped visitors succumb to whatever force controlled the town. Some simply stopped trying to leave, integrating themselves into the community and taking on roles as shopkeepers or service providers. Others disappeared entirely, vanishing without explanation, their absence unacknowledged by the remaining residents. He began to suspect that Millbrook existed in some kind of pocket dimension, a place that had somehow separated itself from normal space and time. The constant problems with electronic devices, the way his photographs showed empty landscape, the impossible geography that made escape impossible, all suggested that the town operated by rules that defied conventional physics. But understanding the nature of his prison didn't help him escape it. If anything, the knowledge made his situation more hopeless. How could he fight something that existed outside normal reality? How could he escape from a place that might not even be part of the physical world? As autumn deepened, Callahan noticed that his memories of the outside world were becoming hazier. Details about his life in Edinburgh seemed less clear. Faces of friends and family grew indistinct. Even his own identity began to feel uncertain. Was he really a photographer named Callahan Morrison? Or was that just a story he told himself, a fantasy to cope with his new reality? The other residents encouraged this mental dissolution, gently suggesting that his old life had been a dream. That Millbrook was where he truly belonged. They spoke of the town's history, how it had been collecting special individuals for generations, creating a community of chosen people who were meant to be there. You're fighting so hard to return to a world that never really understood you, Serafina told him during one of their evening conversations. Here you can be part of something meaningful, something eternal. Why cling to a life that was always temporary? Her words carried a hypnotic quality that made them difficult to resist. There was truth in what she said. His old life had been solitary, focused on capturing images of places and people he never really connected with. In Millbrook, he felt a strange sense of belonging, even if that belonging came with a terrible price. But something deep inside him continued to resist, some core part of his identity that refused to surrender. Perhaps it was his artistic nature, his trained eye for detecting what was real versus what was manufactured. He could see through the facades, recognize the theatrical nature of much of what he encountered, and that awareness kept him from fully succumbing to the town's influence. Late one night, while the other residents slept, Callahan made a discovery that changed everything. He had been exploring the church, one of the few buildings in Millbrook that seemed genuinely historical rather than artificially constructed. In the basement, behind a locked door he managed to force open, he found a room filled with personal belongings, suitcases, cameras, mobile phones, car keys, all arranged in neat rows like museum exhibits. Each collection of items told the story of someone who had arrived in Millbrook and never left. Hundreds of people over what appeared to be decades, their possessions carefully preserved, waiting for owners who would never return. Among the items, Callahan found journals and diaries, desperate accounts written by previous visitors who had documented their own attempts to escape. The stories were heartbreakingly similar to his own. Initial confusion, growing panic, gradual resignation, and finally acceptance. The most recent entries often expressed contentment with their situation, gratitude for being chosen by the town, love for their new community. But it was the oldest items that truly terrified him, belongings that dated back to the 1960s and 70s, suggesting that Millbrook had been trapping visitors for over 50 years. And if the town had existed that long, consuming hundreds of people without anyone in the outside world noticing, then his own disappearance would likely go unnoticed as well. He found photographs taken by previous visitors who had documented their own experiences. The images showed the same facades he had noticed, the same impossibly cheerful residents, the same theatrical quality that pervaded everything in Millbrook. But they also revealed changes over time, new buildings appearing, old ones disappearing, residents aging or being replaced by newcomers. Most disturbing were the photographs that showed the gradual transformation of trapped visitors. Images of people who had initially appeared distressed and desperate, slowly becoming more relaxed, more integrated, until finally they wore the same wide smiles as the original residents. The progression was documented like a medical case study, showing how the town gradually consumed its victims' identities. Callahan realized that he was seeing his own future, documented in dozens of individual stories. He would continue to resist for weeks or months, gradually wearing down under the constant pressure, until finally he would accept his fate, take on some role in the community, and help the town capture its next victim, unless he could find a way to break the cycle, to escape before his will was completely broken. But every previous visitor had faced the same challenge, and none of them had succeeded. Their belongings in the basement were proof of that failure. The discovery filled him with renewed determination. He would not become another museum exhibit in Millbrook's collection. He would find a way out, even if it meant taking desperate risks, even if it cost him his life. Better to die trying than to live as a hollow puppet in this impossible town. But as winter approached, Callahan's situation became even more desperate. The cold weather made outdoor exploration more difficult. The shorter days left him with less time for escape attempts. And worst of all, he could feel his own resistance weakening. The constant stress was exhausting, and the idea of simply giving up became increasingly tempting. The residents seemed to sense his growing vulnerability. Their attention became more focused, their smiles more predatory. They spoke more frequently about the benefits of staying, the foolishness of clinging to his old life, the peace that came with acceptance. Their words carried a hypnotic power that was becoming harder to resist. Eloan, in particular, seemed to have taken a special interest in his conversion. She would appear at random moments, offering comfort when he was most discouraged, providing rational explanations for irrational phenomena, slowly normalizing the impossible situation he found himself in. "You're special, Callahan," she would tell him. "The town doesn't choose just anyone. You have qualities that make you valuable to our community, talents that can flourish here in ways they never could in the outside world." Her attention was seductive in a way that went beyond mere psychological manipulation. There was something almost supernatural about her influence, as if she could speak directly to parts of his mind that reason couldn't protect. When she was nearby, his desire to escape would fade, replaced by a strange contentment that felt foreign yet appealing. Only when he was alone, reviewing the evidence he had gathered, looking at the photographs and journals from previous victims, could he remember why he needed to resist. The physical proof of Millbrook's predatory nature served as an anchor to reality, preventing him from completely losing himself in the town's seductive fantasies. But as his third month in Millbrook began, Callahan realized that time was running out. Each day brought new erosions to his identity, new compromises with his captors, new moments of genuine pleasure in his interactions with the residents. He was slowly becoming the person they wanted him to be, and soon that transformation would be irreversible. In desperation, he decided to attempt the most dangerous escape plan he could conceive. Rather than trying to leave by road, he would venture into the wilderness surrounding Millbrook, hiking cross-country in a straight line away from the town, ignoring paths and roads entirely. If the town's geography was somehow twisted or artificial, then perhaps leaving conventional routes behind would break him free from its influence. He prepared carefully for the journey, gathering supplies, studying maps, planning a route that would take him through the most difficult terrain possible. He told the residents that he was planning an extended photography expedition, documenting the winter landscape around Millbrook. They seemed pleased by his apparent acceptance of his situation, not recognizing that he was planning his final escape attempt. The night before his departure, Eloan visited him at his room at the inn. Her usual bright demeanor was replaced by something more serious, more genuinely concerned. "I know what you're planning," she said softly, "and I want you to understand. What you're risking isn't just your own life. You're part of something important now, something that has taken generations to build." She explained that Millbrook wasn't just a trap, but a sanctuary, a place where special individuals could live free from the constraints and disappointments of the modern world. The town existed to protect and nurture people who were too sensitive, too gifted, too pure for ordinary society. Being chosen was an honor, not a punishment. The outside world is harsh and unforgiving. She continued, "It crushes creativity and uniqueness. It rewards conformity and mediocrity. Here you can be yourself, truly yourself, without judgment or limitation. Why would you want to return to a world that never appreciated what you had to offer?" Her words carried a terrible logic that was hard to refute. Callahan's life in Edinburgh had been increasingly lonely and unfulfilling. His photography career was stagnating. His relationships were shallow. His daily existence felt meaningless and repetitive. In some ways, Millbrook really did offer something better, but he forced himself to remember that the choice should be his, that being trapped, even in paradise, was still imprisonment, that a life without freedom, no matter how comfortable, was not truly life at all. He thanked Eloan for her concern, assured her that he was simply planning to document the surrounding landscape, and promised to return by evening. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what he was planning, and exactly how it would end. The next morning, Callahan set out into the wilderness with his camera equipment and survival gear. The townspeople waved goodbye cheerfully, calling out warnings about the weather and reminders to be careful. Their concern seemed genuine, which made their captivity even more unsettling. They truly believed they were protecting him, keeping him safe from a dangerous world. The hiking was brutal from the very beginning. The terrain around Millbrook was far more difficult than it had appeared from a distance. Rocky outcroppings forced constant detours. Dense forests blocked direct travel. Streams and ravines created obstacles that added hours to his journey. By midday, he had covered less ground than he had hoped, but he pressed on, determined to reach whatever boundary contained the town's influence. As afternoon wore on, Callahan began to notice familiar landmarks. The same distinctive rock formation he had passed hours earlier, the same dead tree with its lightning-scarred trunk, the same view of distant hills that he had already photographed. It was as if the landscape was repeating itself, folding back on itself in impossible ways. But he refused to give up. Even if the geography was somehow warped, there had to be limits to the effect, some boundary beyond which normal space and time resumed. He pushed deeper into the wilderness, ignoring the growing exhaustion in his legs, the biting cold that penetrated his winter clothing, the approaching darkness that made further travel dangerous. Night fell while he was still hiking, plunging the landscape into absolute darkness. Without artificial light, the Scottish wilderness became a maze of hidden dangers. Unseen cliffs, hidden streams, treacherous footing that could result in serious injury. Callahan was forced to make camp, huddling in a sleeping bag while wind howled through the trees around him. Sleep came in brief, troubled intervals, filled with dreams of Millbrook's residents searching for him, their two white smiles glowing in the darkness, their voices calling his name from every direction, promising warmth and safety if he would just give up this foolish quest and return home, where he belonged, where he was needed. Dawn brought renewed determination, along with the crushing realization that his supplies were already running low. He had packed for a day hike, not an extended wilderness expedition. If he didn't reach civilization soon, he would be forced to return to Millbrook or risk dying of exposure in the mountains. The second day of hiking was even more difficult than the first. The terrain became increasingly hostile, as if the landscape itself was actively opposing his escape. Paths that had seemed clear the day before were now blocked by fallen trees. Streams that had been shallow were now raging torrents. Weather that had been merely cold became bitter and dangerous. Most disturbing of all, Callahan began hearing voices, not the wind through the trees or his own exhausted imagination, but actual human voices calling his name from impossible directions. Sometimes they seemed to come from directly overhead, other times from deep underground, always just out of sight, always promising safety and warmth if he would just stop running and come home. The voices belonged to people he recognized. Eloan's motherly concern, Dorian's cheerful hospitality, even the French couple who had given up their escape attempts. All of them speaking in unison sometimes, their words overlapping and echoing through the wilderness in ways that defied acoustics. "Callahan, you're going to freeze out here. Come back to us. We're worried about you." By the third day, his food was completely gone. His water supply was dangerously low, and hypothermia was becoming a real threat. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and his winter gear was not designed for extended exposure. His fingers were numb, his thinking sluggish, his coordination deteriorating. Every step required tremendous effort, but still he pushed forward, driven by a desperate hope that somewhere ahead lay the boundary of Millbrook's influence, some invisible line beyond which normal geography resumed, where his mobile phone would work, where rescue would be possible. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Returning to the town meant accepting defeat, surrendering his identity, becoming another smiling puppet in their collection. Then, just as darkness was falling on his third night in the wilderness, Callahan saw something that made his heart leap with hope. Lights in the distance. Not the warm yellow glow of Millbrook Street lamps, but the harsh white beams of vehicle headlights, moving along what appeared to be a proper road. The first sign of normal civilization he had encountered since entering this nightmare. He changed direction immediately, stumbling through the darkness toward those distant lights. Branches tore at his clothing, rocks turned his ankles, but he pressed on, driven by the possibility that rescue was finally within reach, that his ordeal might be coming to an end. The road, when he finally reached it, was everything he had hoped for. Modern asphalt, proper markings, even reflective guardrails that gleamed in his flashlight beam. This was clearly part of the normal transportation infrastructure, not the twisted geography that surrounded Millbrook. He had done it. He had found the boundary. A vehicle approached within minutes of his arrival at the roadside, a lorry with proper UK registration plates and commercial markings. The driver, a burly man with a Geordie accent, seemed genuinely surprised to encounter someone on foot in such a remote location. "Bloody hell, mate, what are you doing out here? You look half frozen." Callahan climbed gratefully into the warm cab, savoring the normalcy of heated seats and radio chatter. The driver, who introduced himself as Bernard Jackson, was traveling from Inverness to Glasgow with a load of building supplies. He had taken this route hundreds of times and knew the area well. When Callahan mentioned Millbrook, Bernard's expression grew puzzled. "Never heard of any town by that name around here." He said, "This whole stretch is just empty moorland. Has been for as long as I can remember." "You sure you got the name right? Maybe you're thinking of Millport down on the coast." Relief flooded through Callahan's system. The outside world still existed. Normal people still went about their normal lives. Millbrook was some kind of isolated anomaly that didn't touch the broader reality. He was free. He had escaped. Bernard drove him to the nearest police station, where Callahan spent several hours giving statements to increasingly skeptical officers. His story of an unmapped town that trapped visitors was clearly difficult for them to believe, especially when he couldn't provide a precise location or any physical evidence. His camera contained only images of empty countryside. His GPS showed no record of Millbrook. Even his own memory seemed strangely vague about specific details. The desk sergeant, a patient woman named Constable Murray, suggested gently that Callahan might have experienced some kind of medical episode. Hypothermia could cause hallucinations and disorientation. The stress of being lost in the wilderness for several days might have triggered psychological symptoms. She recommended that he see a doctor, get proper medical attention, and perhaps speak with a counselor about his experiences. But Callahan knew what he had experienced. The basement full of belongings, the journals of previous victims, the impossible geography that made escape nearly impossible. It had all been terrifyingly real. Even if he couldn't prove it, even if the evidence had somehow vanished, He knew the truth about Millbrook. The police arranged transportation back to Edinburgh, where Callahan attempted to resume his normal life. But nothing felt normal anymore. His apartment seemed alien and temporary. His photography work felt meaningless. Friends and colleagues noticed changes in his behavior, a haunted quality that he couldn't hide or explain. He researched everything he could find about missing persons in the Scottish Highlands, looking for patterns that might support his experience. And slowly, disturbing correlations began to emerge. Dozens of people had vanished in that region over the decades. Tourists, hikers, photographers like himself, all disappeared without explanation. Their vehicles sometimes found abandoned, their belongings scattered, but the people themselves never located. The official explanations varied. Accidents, suicides, people choosing to disappear and start new lives. But Callahan recognized the true pattern. All of these missing persons had vanished in the same general area where he had encountered Millbrook. All had been alone when they disappeared. All had been the sort of creative, sensitive individuals that Alohan had described as special. He tried contacting the families of the missing, hoping to find others who suspected something more sinister than simple accidents. But these conversations were painful and frustrating. Grieving relatives who had spent years hoping for answers didn't want to hear theories about supernatural towns and impossible geography. His stories only added to their suffering. Months passed. Callahan attempted to return to normal life, but sleep brought nightly dreams of Millbrook, visions of Alohan's too wide smile, Dorian's predatory hospitality, the sound of voices calling his name through the wilderness. He would wake exhausted, drenched in sweat, with the absolute certainty that the town was still out there, still collecting victims, still growing stronger. His photography suffered. Every landscape reminded him of the Scottish Highlands. Every small town made him think of Millbrook's facades. He found himself avoiding rural areas entirely, sticking to cities where the presence of crowds provided psychological safety, where reality felt solid and unquestionable. But the worst part was the doubt, the creeping suspicion that perhaps Constable Murray had been right, that his memories of Millbrook were elaborate hallucinations brought on by hypothermia and stress. The lack of any physical evidence made it impossible to be certain. Maybe he had simply gotten lost in the wilderness, suffering a psychological breakdown that had created false memories to explain his ordeal. Yet the belongings in that basement had been so detailed, so specific. The journals written by previous victims had contained information he couldn't have invented. Names, dates, personal details that seemed too authentic to be products of his imagination. If Millbrook was a delusion, it was remarkably consistent and elaborate. The uncertainty was almost worse than the experience itself. At least in Millbrook, he had known what he was fighting against. Here in the normal world, he couldn't even be sure of his own sanity. His grip on reality felt tenuous, constantly threatened by the possibility that everything he believed about his experience was false. A year passed. Callahan had largely stopped talking about Millbrook. His friends and family were relieved, assuming he had recovered from whatever trauma had affected him. But privately, he continued his research, mapping patterns of disappearances, studying historical records, looking for any evidence that might support his memories. Then, on a gray autumn morning that reminded him painfully of his first encounter with the town, Callahan received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, slightly yellowed with age, showing a familiar street scene. The main square of Millbrook, complete with the Victorian Town Hall and its distinctive clock tower. But this photograph was old, very old. The clothing worn by people in the street suggested it had been taken in the 1950s or 60s, decades before Callahan's birth. Yet the town looked essentially identical to what he remembered. The same buildings, the same layout, even the same two wide smiles on the faces of the residents. Attached to the photograph was a brief handwritten note. "You're not the first to escape. You won't be the last. But remember, Millbrook never forgets. It's patient. It can wait." The note was unsigned, but something about the handwriting seemed familiar. Callahan spent hours studying it, trying to place where he might have seen that particular script before. Then, with a chill that seemed to freeze his blood, he remembered The same handwriting had appeared in one of the journals he had found in Millbrook's basement, the desperate account of a visitor from the 1970s who had documented his failed escape attempts. If that person had somehow survived, if they had managed to get away, then Callahan wasn't insane. Millbrook was real. And according to the note, the town wasn't finished with him. It was waiting, watching, planning to reclaim what it considered its property. The photograph and note changed everything. Callahan could no longer pretend that his experience had been a delusion. The town existed. It had existed for decades. And it had some way of reaching into the outside world, some method of maintaining contact with those who had escaped its direct influence. He began taking precautions, varying his daily routines, checking for signs that he was being watched or followed, installing security systems in his apartment. But how could he defend against something that existed outside normal reality, something that could manipulate space and time, that could appear anywhere, anytime? The paranoia was exhausting. Every stranger on the street might be a Millbrook resident. Every unexpected sound might herald their arrival. Sleep became increasingly difficult. Work became impossible. His carefully rebuilt life began to crumble under the weight of constant fear. Then came the phone calls, always at night, always from numbers that didn't exist when he tried to call them back. Familiar voices speaking in cheerful tones about how much they missed him, how wonderful it would be when he returned home, how patient they were willing to be. "We know you're struggling out there." The Lowen's voice would whisper through the static. "The normal world doesn't understand you the way we do. You're fighting so hard to belong somewhere that will never truly accept you. Why not come home, where you're loved, where you're needed?" The calls came more frequently as winter approached, sometimes multiple times per night, always with the same message of understanding and acceptance, always with the promise that his suffering would end if he would just give up his futile resistance. The voices were hypnotically convincing, appealing to his deepest insecurities and loneliness. Callahan tried changing his phone number, but the calls continued. He tried leaving the phone unplugged, but would wake to find messages waiting, conversations he didn't remember having, promises he didn't remember making. His grip on reality was slipping again, but this time he knew it wasn't his imagination. The dreams became more vivid, more detailed. He would find himself walking through Millbrook streets, talking with residents, even helping with daily tasks around the town. These nocturnal visits felt completely real, more solid and meaningful than his waking life. When morning came, the normal world seemed pale and artificial by comparison. During these dream visits, Lowen would explain gently that his resistance was hurting him, that the boundary between Millbrook and the outside world was thinner than he imagined, that eventually he would understand that there was no real difference between dreaming of the town and actually being there. Reality is what you make it. She would tell him as they walked past familiar shops and houses. Your mind creates the world you experience. If you're happier here, if you feel more yourself here, then this is where you belong. Fighting that truth only causes unnecessary pain. The logic was seductive and terrifying. If his experiences of Millbrook were as real as his experiences of Edinburgh, then which world was the true one? If he felt more genuine connection with the town's residents than with his actual friends and family, then perhaps Lowen was right about where he belonged. But some stubborn part of his mind continued to resist. The same artistic sensibility that had allowed him to see through Millbrook's facades during his original visit. He could recognize the manipulation even as he felt its appeal, could understand that his growing attachment to the town was being artificially induced, engineered through psychological pressure and supernatural influence. The situation reached a crisis point when Callahan realized he was beginning to forget important details about his regular life. Names of friends became uncertain. Memories of childhood seemed vague. Even basic facts about his identity felt questionable, while simultaneously, his recollections of Millbrook became more vivid and detailed. The town was replacing his authentic memories with its own manufactured experiences. In desperation, he decided to document everything he could remember about his original life, writing detailed accounts of his relationships, his career, his hopes and dreams, creating a written record that could anchor his identity when his memory began to fail. Physical proof of who he had been before Millbrook began its psychological invasion. The process was agonizing. Each memory felt like it was slipping away as he tried to capture it in words. Names and faces that had once been central to his existence now seemed distant and unimportant. Meanwhile, fictional memories of life in Millbrook felt increasingly real, more emotionally resonant than his actual experiences. He also began researching methods of psychological resistance, studying accounts of prisoners who had maintained their sanity under extreme duress, learning techniques for preserving identity in the face of systematic brainwashing. If Millbrook was using psychological warfare, then he needed to arm himself with mental defenses. But the town's influence was subtle and pervasive. It didn't attack his mind directly. Instead, it offered comfort, understanding, a sense of belonging that his normal life lacked. The manipulation was disguised as genuine care and affection, making it almost impossible to reject without feeling guilty and ungrateful. Winter deepened. The phone calls became more frequent, the dreams more immersive. Callahan found himself looking forward to sleep, to his nocturnal visits to Millbrook. The town's residents had become more real to him than his actual neighbors, their problems and concerns more engaging than his own career challenges. He began to understand how previous victims had surrendered. The gradual erosion of identity wasn't painful. It was relief, a slow release from the burdens of individual responsibility, from the loneliness of autonomous existence. Millbrook offered something that the modern world rarely provided: genuine community, unconditional acceptance, a sense of purpose and belonging. But it came at the cost of everything that made him human: his creativity, his independence, his ability to choose his own path through life. The town wanted to possess him completely, to transform him into another smiling automaton serving its mysterious purposes. And once that transformation was complete, there would be no way back. The final confrontation came on the anniversary of his original escape. Exactly 1 year after he had stumbled out of the wilderness and into Bernard's lorry, Callahan woke from a particularly vivid dream of Millbrook to find his apartment had changed. The walls had shifted, the furniture rearranged. Even a view from his windows showed different scenery. But the changes were subtle, almost impossible to detect unless you were looking for them. A painting moved slightly to the left, books rearranged on shelves, the color of certain objects shifted by barely perceptible degrees. Millbrook wasn't replacing his reality. It was gradually blending with it, merging the two worlds until the distinction became meaningless. Eloan was sitting in his kitchen when he went to make coffee, not in his dreams, but physically present in his apartment, wearing the same long coat and headscarf she had worn during their first encounter. Her smile was as wide and unsettling as ever, but her presence felt completely natural, as if she belonged there. "Good morning," she said pleasantly, pouring tea from a pot that definitely hadn't been there the night before. "I thought it was time we had a proper conversation, face to face, about your future." Callahan's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced himself to appear calm, to engage with her as if supernatural visitations were perfectly normal. "How did you get here?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Distance is relative," she replied with that maddening smile. "Millbrook exists wherever it needs to, wherever its residents require comfort and guidance. You've been so unhappy here, so isolated. We thought perhaps a more direct approach might help." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Callahan had ever experienced. Eloan spoke with perfect knowledge of his life, his fears, his disappointments. She knew about failed relationships, professional setbacks, moments of profound loneliness that he had never shared with anyone. Her understanding was complete and compassionate, her solutions seductively simple. "You're fighting so hard to maintain a life that brings you no joy," she observed gently. "Clinging to relationships that don't fulfill you, pursuing a career that leaves you empty, defending a reality that offers nothing but struggle and disappointment. What are you really trying to preserve?" The question cut to the heart of everything he had been avoiding. His life in Edinburgh was largely hollow, filled with shallow connections and meaningless achievements. His photography had become routine, his friendships superficial, His daily existence a series of mechanical responses to external expectations. Millbrook offered something radically different. A community where his talents were valued, where his presence made a difference, where he could be part of something larger than himself. The town's residents genuinely cared for each other. Their happiness seemed authentic, their sense of purpose unshakable. But it's not real. Callahan protested weakly. It's all artificial, manufactured. You're manipulating people, stealing their identities. Alohan's expression grew sad, almost pitying. What makes you think your current life is more real? The modern world is built on artificial constructs, social media personas, corporate identities, consumer fantasies. At least in Millbrook, people are genuinely themselves, free from the masks and pretenses that normal society demands. Her words carried a terrible logic that was hard to refute. How much of his identity was authentic, and how much was simply conforming to social expectations, performing the role of a successful photographer rather than actually being one? Millbrook might be artificial, but was the alternative any more genuine? The conversation continued for hours. Alohan never pressured, never threatened, simply presented her perspective with infinite patience and understanding. She acknowledged his fears, validated his concerns, but consistently demonstrated how those objections were based on assumptions rather than facts. You escaped once, she reminded him, but did your life improve? Are you happier now than you were during your time with us? Do you feel more fulfilled, more connected, more at peace with yourself? The honest answer was devastating. His year of freedom had been marked by anxiety, isolation, and a growing sense of meaninglessness. His memories of Millbrook, even knowing they might be false, were more emotionally satisfying than anything he had experienced since. As afternoon faded to evening, Alohan's presence became less distinct, her voice more distant, but her words continued to echo in his mind. She had planted seeds of doubt that would grow and flourish, questions about identity and authenticity that couldn't be easily dismissed. Think about what you truly want, she said as she began to fade. Not what you think you should want, not what others expect of you, but what would genuinely make you happy. We'll be waiting when you decide. The apartment returned to normal after her departure, but Callahan knew the boundaries had been permanently altered. Millbrook could reach him anywhere, anytime. His escape had been temporary at best. The town was patient, willing to wait for his psychological defenses to crumble, for his resistance to exhaust itself. That night brought the most vivid dreams yet. Not just visits to Millbrook, but memories of a life he had never lived. Growing up in the town, attending school with other residents, learning a trade, falling in love, experiencing the deep satisfaction of belonging to a community where everyone knew and valued each other. These false memories felt more real than his actual childhood, more emotionally resonant than his genuine experiences. They showed him what his life could have been, what it still might become, if he was willing to let go of his stubborn attachment to a world that had never truly accepted him. Callahan woke the next morning with tears on his face, grieving for experiences he had never had, for a version of himself he had never been allowed to become. The contrast between those beautiful false memories and his actual life was almost unbearable. He tried to resume his normal routine, but nothing felt authentic anymore. Every interaction seemed scripted, every emotion manufactured. His photography work felt like meaningless documentation of a world he no longer believed in. His friendships seemed shallow, built on shared activities rather than genuine understanding. Meanwhile, his phantom memories of Millbrook grew stronger, more detailed, more emotionally complex. He could remember conversations with residents, shared meals at the inn, even romantic relationships with people who had never existed. These fictional experiences provided the emotional depth and connection that his real life lacked. The psychological pressure was incredible, like being torn between two different versions of reality, one authentic but unsatisfying, the other artificial but deeply fulfilling. Millbrook wasn't just offering him a different life. It was showing him who he could have been, who he still might become. As spring approached, Callahan realized his resistance was crumbling. The town's patient campaign was succeeding. His attachment to the outside world was weakening, while his longing for Millbrook grew stronger. Soon he would reach a tipping point, a moment when the desire to surrender would overpower his need for freedom. But perhaps that wasn't entirely bad. Perhaps Aloan had been right about the nature of choice and authenticity. If he was genuinely happier in his dreams of Millbrook than in his waking life, then which was the real prison? His apartment in Edinburgh or the town that didn't exist on any map? The decision, he realized, was ultimately about what kind of person he wanted to be. Someone who fought for abstract principles like freedom and individual identity, or someone who chose happiness and belonging, even if those gifts came with strings attached. There was no purely right answer, only different kinds of compromise. As the anniversary of Aloan's visit approached, Callahan found himself preparing, not for resistance, but for surrender, packing his essential belongings, arranging his affairs, writing letters to friends and family that he would never send. He was getting ready to go home, to the only place where he had ever truly belonged. The phone rang at exactly midnight. Aloan's voice warm and welcoming. "Are you ready?" she asked simply. Callahan looked around his apartment one last time, at the life he was leaving behind, the identity he was abandoning, the freedom he was sacrificing. Then he smiled genuinely, for the first time in months. "Yes," he whispered. "I'm ready to come home." The line went dead, but he knew they were coming for him. Soon he would be back in Millbrook, back where the clocks showed different times, where the residents smiled too wide, where every road led to the town square, back to the place that had chosen him, that had waited patiently for his return. And perhaps, in surrendering his freedom, he would finally find the peace that had eluded him in the outside world. Perhaps Millbrook's gift wasn't imprisonment, but liberation from the exhausting pretense of modern life, a chance to be genuinely happy, even if that happiness came at a terrible price. The last thing Callahan Morrison remembered of his old life was the sound of footsteps in the hallway, approaching his door with measured, patient steps. The residents of Millbrook had come to bring him home, and he was ready to go. Years later, hikers in the Scottish Highlands would occasionally report sightings of a mysterious town nestled in a valley that didn't appear on any maps, a place where friendly residents greeted visitors with unusually wide smiles, where the local and offered comfortable accommodations, where travelers sometimes decided to extend their stays much longer than originally planned. Those who managed to leave would tell stories of helpful locals, beautiful architecture, and a strange sense of timelessness that made the outside world seem harsh and unwelcoming by comparison. But their photographs would show only empty moorland, their GPS devices would malfunction, and official investigations would find no evidence of any settlement in the area. The authorities would classify these reports as hallucinations caused by exposure and fatigue, the rational explanation for irrational experiences. But the hikers knew what they had seen, what they had felt. Some would return to search for the town again, driving deeper and deeper into the wilderness, following roads that led in impossible directions. And sometimes, just sometimes, they would find what they were looking for. A place where everyone smiled too wide, where clocks showed different times, where every path eventually led back to the town square. A place that collected special people, sensitive souls who deserved better than what the modern world could offer. A place called Millbrook that existed wherever it needed to, whenever someone required the gift of genuine belonging, even if they didn't yet understand that was what they truly wanted. The town was patient. It could wait. It had all the time in the world. After all, some gifts are too precious to refuse, even when they come disguised as nightmares, even when accepting them means leaving everything familiar behind. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is surrendering the illusion of choice and embracing the destiny that has been waiting all along. Millbrook never forgets, and it never gives up, because somewhere out there, another lost soul is driving through the remote countryside, following GPS directions that lead nowhere, searching for something they can't name, but desperately need to find. And when they crest that familiar hilltop, when they see the warm lights glowing in the valley below, when they realize they've discovered a town that doesn't exist on any map, they'll think they've stumbled upon the adventure of a lifetime. They'll have no idea that the adventure has only just begun. Thank you so much for watching this terrifying journey into the unknown. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, if it made you question what's real and what's merely illusion, then please show your support by smashing that like button, hitting subscribe, and ringing the notification bell so you never miss our spine-chilling content. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me where in the world you're watching from, what time it is in your location, and most importantly, what topics would you like me to explore next? Do you want more stories about mysterious towns that trap visitors? Perhaps tales of haunted roads that lead nowhere? Or maybe you'd prefer stories about people who discover they've been living false lives? Have you ever had your own paranormal experiences? Have you encountered places that seem to exist outside normal reality? If so, please share your stories in the comments or send them to our email. Your real experiences could become the inspiration for our next terrifying episode. What did you think of Callahan's ultimate choice? Do you believe he made the right decision? Would you have fought harder to maintain your freedom? Or would you have surrendered to the promise of belonging and happiness? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I love engaging with our community about these deep philosophical questions. And remember, reality is often stranger than fiction. The most terrifying stories are the ones that could actually be true. So next time you're driving through remote countryside, next time your GPS stops working and you discover a town that isn't on any map, ask yourself, what would you do? Until next time, keep your eyes open, trust your instincts, and remember, some invitations are too dangerous to accept, even when they promise everything you've ever wanted. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next spine-tingling episode.